They threw Mpho's small bag onto the street, like she was nothing. You thought a guard would marry you. Someone laughed. Shameless girl. Her hands trembled, not from guilt, but from exhaustion. She had given him food when he was hungry, defended him when others mocked him, trusted him when no one else would. And now, everyone was watching her fall. Across the crowd, Mpho stood in silence, his worn uniform, his lowered eyes, his unreadable face. But what no one knew was that the poor guard they were humiliating her for was actually one of the most powerful billionaires in the country. And he was about to make a choice that would change everything. Before we continue, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? If you love emotional stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. In a quiet, crowded corner of Johannesburg where the streets never truly slept and the hum of survival filled the air from dawn to midnight, Mpho Dlamini had already learned what it meant to live without softness. At just 24, she carried more weight than most people, twice her age. Not the kind you could see from afar, but the kind that settled in the bones, in the silence between breaths, in the way she paused before spending even the smallest coin. Her mother had died 2 years earlier. No long goodbye, no time to prepare. Just one fever that refused to break, one hospital bill they could not pay, and one morning where the world became permanently quieter. Since then, it had been Mpho and Thabo. Thabo was only 12, but life had already begun, testing him in ways no child should understand. A persistent cough had turned into something deeper, something that left him weak, breathless, and unable to attend school regularly. Some days he would try to smile through it. Other days he couldn't even sit up without help. And every single day Mpho woke up with one thought pressing against her chest. Don't let him feel alone. She worked wherever she could, cleaning jobs, laundry, helping at roadside food stalls, carrying boxes in the early morning markets. Nothing permanent, nothing stable. Just enough to survive another day, if she was careful. That morning, like many others, began before sunrise. The room they lived in was small, barely enough space for 2 thin mattresses, a cracked plastic table, and a single metal chair. The walls were stained with years of dampness, and the window didn't close properly, letting in cold air during the night. Mpho sat at the edge of her mattress, tying her worn shoes slowly, quietly. Thabo stirred behind her. "You're leaving already." His voice came out soft, still heavy with sleep. She turned immediately, her face changing the moment she looked at him. "I didn't want to wake you," she said gently, walking over. "You should rest more." He tried to sit up but winced slightly, pressing a hand against his chest. Mpho noticed. She always noticed. "I'm fine," he said quickly, forcing a small smile. "You always worry too much." She knelt beside him, brushing his forehead with the back of her hand, not checking for fever, but checking for something deeper, something harder to name. "I have to," she whispered. "That's my job now." Thabo looked at her, his eyes holding a quiet understanding, far beyond his years. "You're not supposed to carry everything alone, Mpho." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not alone," she said. "I have you." He wanted to say something more, but instead he just nodded. Because they both knew the truth. She was carrying everything. Before leaving, Mpho reached into a small tin box hidden under the table. Inside were carefully folded notes, money she had been saving, little by little. She counted it again, even though she already knew the amount. Still not enough. Never enough. She closed the box slowly, took a deep breath, and stood. "I'll bring something warm for you later," she said. "Try to eat okay." Thabo nodded again, and just like that she stepped out into the waking city. Johannesburg at that hour was a mixture of movement and stillness. Street vendors setting up stalls, minibus taxis honking impatiently, workers rushing past each other without eye contact. The air carried the smell of fried food dust and possibility, but also exhaustion. Mpho walked quickly, her pace steady, her eyes focused. Today mattered. She had heard about temporary cleaning work at a large office complex in Santon, a place where people wore suits instead of worry, where glass buildings reflected a version of life she had never touched. It wasn't guaranteed. Nothing ever was. But it was a chance. And chances were things she couldn't afford to ignore. The building stood, tall, polished, almost too perfect for the world around it. Mpho paused for just a second at the entrance, not out of fear but out of awareness. Places like this didn't usually open their doors to people like her. But she stepped forward anyway. Inside, everything was different. The floors shined. The air smelled clean. Conversations were quiet, controlled, professional. People moved with purpose, but not with urgency. Not like survival. She approached the reception desk, explaining softly why she was there. After a brief exchange, a supervisor was called. The woman who approached her mid-40s, sharp posture eyes that measured more than they saw, looked Mpho up and down in a single glance. "You've done cleaning work before?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Mpho replied calmly. "Temporary position. Night shifts mostly. Low pay. No guarantees." Mpho nodded. "I understand." The woman studied her for another moment, then gave a short nod. "Report this evening. Don't be late." And just like that, another door opened. Later that evening, as the sun dipped and the building emptied of its daytime power, Mpho returned. This time, through a different entrance, the service side, where the lights were dimmer, where the conversations were louder, where people like her existed without being seen. She was given a simple uniform, a list of tasks, a section of the building to clean. No introduction, no welcome. Just work, and she accepted it without complaint. It was close to midnight when she first noticed him, standing near the back corridor, a security guard. His uniform looked older than the others, slightly worn, slightly faded. His posture was straight, but there was something quiet about him. Not tired, not careless, just still. Most people would have walked past without noticing, but Mpho didn't, because she had learned to see people others ignored. She pushed her cleaning cart slowly down the hallway, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. As she passed him, their eyes met just for a second. And in that second, something unspoken happened. Not recognition, not familiarity, just awareness. He nodded slightly. Not the dismissive kind, not the indifferent kind, but the kind that said, "I see you." Mpho nodded back and kept walking. His name, at least the one everyone knew, was Mpho. A quiet god, one of many, invisible in a building full of importance. But behind that name was Nkosi's wide, a man whose real life existed far above these walls. A billionaire, an heir, a man who had grown tired of being surrounded by people who saw his wealth before they saw him. So he disappeared. Not completely. Just enough. He wanted to see what remained when everything else was stripped away. Respect, kindness, truth, things money could never buy. And that night, for the first time in a long time, someone had looked at him without expectation, without calculation, without pretense. As Mpho continued working down the corridor, she didn't look back. She had no reason to. To her, he was just another worker trying to get through the night, just like her. But something about that brief moment lingered, not in her thoughts, but somewhere deeper, somewhere quiet. And behind her, Mpho stood still for a few seconds longer than necessary, watching her walk away, not with curiosity, but with something far more dangerous. Interest, the kind he had not felt in a very long time, the kind that didn't come from beauty or status or charm, but from something rare, something honest, something real. Neither of them knew it yet, But that small, silent exchange would become the beginning of everything. The nights in the Santon complex had their own rhythm. By the time Mpho arrived for her shift each evening, the building had already transformed. The sharp voices of executives were gone, replaced by the hum of air conditioning, the distant echo of footsteps, and the quiet labor of people who existed only after everyone else had left. It was a different world, one where invisibility was not just common, it was expected. Mpho adjusted quickly. She learned which floors required extra attention, which offices were left in chaos, and which supervisors inspected without warning. She worked carefully, efficiently, never cutting corners, even when no one was watching. Because for her work wasn't just work, it was survival, and survival demanded discipline. By her third night, she noticed him again, Mpho, standing near the same corridor. Always calm, always observant, unlike the other guards who often leaned against walls, joked loudly, or checked their phones between rounds. Mpho seemed present, alert in a quiet, controlled way. Mpho didn't approach him, not yet, but she noticed, and somehow he noticed that she noticed. The first real interaction happened by accident, or at least it seemed that way. Mpho had just finished cleaning one of the upper-floor offices when she realized she had skipped her break. It wasn't unusual. Time slipped easily when your mind was focused on finishing tasks before exhaustion caught up. She sat down briefly in a service corridor, pulling out a small container from her bag. Inside was simple food pap and a bit of stew she had saved from earlier. Not much, but enough. She was about to take her first bite when she heard footsteps. Slow, measured. She looked up. Mpho. He paused when he saw her, as if unsure whether to continue walking or turn back. Mpho gave a small nod. "You can pass," she said quietly. But he didn't move immediately. Instead, his eyes flickered briefly toward the container in her hands, then away again, almost as if he didn't want to be caught looking. It was a small moment, so small that most people wouldn't have noticed, but Mpho did, because hunger had a language, and she understood it. Without saying anything, she shifted slightly and held the container out. "It's not much," she said, "but you can share." Mpho hesitated, not because he didn't want it, but because he wasn't used to being offered anything without expectation. "I'm fine," he said at first. Mpho gave a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to pretend with me." There was no accusation in her voice, no pressure, just quiet honesty. And for a moment, just a moment, Mpho felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. He stepped closer, sat down beside her, carefully, not too close, not too far. They shared the food in silence at first. No introductions, no unnecessary words. Just the soft sound of spoons against plastic and the quiet understanding of two people who knew what it meant to go without. "What's your name?" Mpho asked after a while. "Mpho," he replied. She nodded. "Mpho." "I know," he said before thinking. She glanced at him, slightly surprised. "You do?" He paused. "I heard the supervisor say it." He added quickly. She accepted the explanation without question. That was who she was. She didn't look for hidden meanings where none were offered. From that night on, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, naturally. They began crossing paths more often. At first, it was just brief exchanges, a nod, a quiet greeting, then a few words. "How's your shift long?" Same, simple things. But in a place where most people spoke only to complain or criticize, even those small conversations felt different. One night, as Mpho pushed her cleaning cart down a hallway, laughter echoed from behind her. Sharp, mocking. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Two other cleaners, Nomsa and Lindaway, had made their opinions about her clear from the beginning. "She thinks she's better than us," Nomsa said loudly, not bothering to lower her voice. Or maybe she thinks she's special, Lindiwe added, always walking around like she's carrying something important. Mpho kept walking. She had learned long ago that not every voice deserved a response. But then, at least we know she's not wasting her time, Namsa continued, spending all her breaks with that useless guard. Laughter, cold, sharp. That one, Lindiwe scoffed. What is she expecting? That he'll suddenly become something. More laughter. Mpho stopped, slowly. Not because she was angry, but because something about the way they spoke about Mpho felt wrong. She turned, faced them, her expression calm, but firm. You shouldn't talk about people like that, she said quietly. Namsa raised an eyebrow. Like what? Like they're nothing. Lindiwe crossed her arms. He is nothing, she said bluntly. Look at him. Mpho's gaze didn't waver. I have, she replied. More than you have. That caught them off guard. What's that supposed to mean? Namsa snapped. It means Mpho said, her voice still steady. Not everyone who looks small is small. Silence hung in the air for a second. Then Lindiwe laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. Please, she said. You're defending him, like he's something important. Mpho shook her head slightly. I'm defending him because he's human. That ended the conversation. Not with victory, not with defeat, but with something else. Respect, even if they didn't want to admit it. Across the corridor unseen by them, Mpho had heard everything. Every word, every tone, every choice Mpho had made. He hadn't stepped in. He hadn't revealed himself. But he had watched, and something inside him had shifted again. Because he had been insulted before. Mocked, dismissed, ignored. It was part of the role he had chosen to play. But no one had ever stood up for him. Not like that. Not without knowing who he really was. Not without expecting something in return. Later that night, when the building had grown even quieter, Mpho found him again. This time he spoke first. You didn't have to do that. She tilted her head slightly. Do what? Defend me. Mpho shrugged lightly. It wasn't about you. He frowned. It wasn't. No, she said. It was about them. He looked confused. They shouldn't get used to speaking like that about anyone, she explained. Because one day, they might say it to the wrong person. Mpho studied her face. There was no pride there. No self-satisfaction. Just simple conviction. Still, he said quietly, Thank you. Mpho gave a small smile. You're welcome. There was a pause. Not awkward. Just quiet. Do you ever get tired? Mpho asked suddenly. Mpho let out a soft breath. All the time. Then why keep going? She looked down at her hands for a moment. Then back up. Because stopping isn't an option. Something in her voice made him stop asking questions. Not because she refused to answer, but because the answer had already been given. That night, as Mpho continued her work and Mpho resumed his rounds, both of them carried something new. Not a promise, not a plan. Just a quiet connection. Built not on who they were supposed to be, but on who they were when no one was looking. And somewhere deep inside Nkosi's wide, the man who had hidden himself from the world, began to realize something dangerous. This was no longer just a test. It was becoming something real. The nights grew colder as the weeks passed, but inside the Santon complex, the temperature never changed. It was always controlled, always measured, unlike the lives of the people who worked quietly within its walls. For Mpho, each day outside the building felt heavier than the one before. Thabo's condition was getting worse. At first, it had only been a cough, persistent, stubborn, but manageable. Now it came in waves that left him breathless, his small body struggling against something neither of them fully understood. She had taken him to a public clinic, twice already. Each time the same answer. Come back with money for proper tests. Money she didn't have. money that seemed to slip further away no matter how hard she worked. That evening, before leaving for her shift, Mpho sat beside Thabo, watching him sleep. His breathing was uneven, too fast, too shallow. She reached out, adjusting the thin blanket over him, though she knew it wouldn't change anything. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel it. The fear. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that sat in your chest and refused to leave. "I'll fix this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I promise." Thabo didn't wake, but she stayed there a few seconds longer than usual, as if leaving him meant risking something she couldn't control. When she finally stepped into the night, her movements felt heavier. But her pace didn't slow. It never did. At work, everything looked the same. Clean floors, bright lights, empty offices. But inside her something had shifted, and Mpho noticed it immediately. She didn't greet him that night. Didn't pause. Didn't smile. She moved past him with quiet focus, pushing her cart with a little more force than usual. Not anger. Just weight. He watched her for a moment, then followed. "Mpho." She stopped. Not immediately, but after a few steps. She turned slowly. "Yes." Her voice was polite, but distant. Mpho stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. "You're different tonight." She gave a small, tired smile. "People are allowed to be tired." "Yes," he said, "but this isn't just tired." There was no accusation in his tone, just observation, and somehow that made it harder to ignore. Mpho hesitated, then looked away. "It's nothing," she said. He didn't believe her, but he didn't push. Instead, he nodded slightly. "If you say so." And just like that, he stepped back, letting her go. But the silence between them that night felt different. Heavier, more aware. Hours later, near the end of her shift, Mpho finally stopped. Not because she was done, but because her body needed it. She leaned against a wall in a quiet corridor, her eyes closing briefly. Just for a second. Just to breathe. "You didn't eat." His voice came softly. She opened her eyes. Mpho stood a few steps away, holding something in his hand. A small paper bag. She frowned slightly. "How do you know that?" "You didn't take your break," he replied simply. She stared at him for a moment, then looked at the bag. "What's that food?" She straightened. "I can't take that." "Why not?" "Because it's yours. I already ate." She shook her head. "You should keep it." Mpho stepped closer, held it out again. "It's just food, Mpho." But to her it wasn't just food. Nothing ever was. It was cost, it was sacrifice, it was something given, and she wasn't used to receiving. "I don't like owing people," she said quietly. His expression softened. "You don't owe me anything." She hesitated, still unsure. Inside, something conflicted. Pride, need, habit, fear. Mpho seemed to understand. "Then don't think of it as help," he said. "Think of it as sharing." The word lingered, because it was familiar, because she had used it before. With him. Slowly, she reached out, took the bag. Their fingers brushed for just a second, but neither of them pulled away immediately. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're welcome." They sat down again in the same quiet corridor where they had first shared food. But tonight, the silence was different. Not empty, not awkward. Just aware. "My brother is sick," Mpho said suddenly. She didn't plan to say it. It just came out. Mpho turned slightly toward her. "How old is he, 12? He nodded. "What's wrong with him?" She shook her head. "I don't know." That answer carried more weight than any explanation. "I took him to a clinic," she continued. "They said he needs tests." And she gave a small, bitter smile. "You already know the answer to that. Money. Always money." Mpho's jaw tightened slightly. Not visibly, but enough. "And you've been handling it alone." Mpho let out a soft breath. There's no one else. He didn't respond immediately, because he understood that answer too well. What's his name? He asked after a moment. Thabo. Mpho nodded. It means joy. Right. Mpho's lips curved slightly. Yes. Is he? She looked down, then smiled again. A little, she said. When he forgets he's sick. There was a pause. Then you shouldn't carry everything alone. The words came quietly, but firmly. Mpho looked at him. There it was again. That same sentence, from Thabo, from him. Different voices, same meaning. She shook her head gently. It doesn't work like that. Why not? Because people don't stay, she said. They help a little. Then they go. Her voice wasn't angry, just certain. Learned. Mpho felt something shift in his chest, not because of what she said, but because of how easily she said it. Like it was a fact, like it was something she had already accepted. I'm not people, he said quietly. The moment the words left his mouth, he realized how dangerous they were. Mpho looked at him carefully. Not suspicious, not hopeful. Just thoughtful. No, she said softly. You're not. That answer stayed with him longer than anything else. Later, as the night came to an end and Mpho prepared to leave, she paused near the exit. Mpho was already there, standing as he always did, watching. My shift starts earlier tomorrow, she said. I might not see you. He nodded. Okay. A small silence followed. Then take care of yourself, he added. Mpho smiled faintly. You too. She turned, walked away, but after a few steps, she stopped. Looked back. Mpho. Yes. She hesitated, then said it anyway. Thank you for seeing me. He didn't answer immediately, because he wasn't sure how to. By the time he looked up, she was already gone. And for the first time since he had chosen this life, since he had stepped away from power, wealth, and everything that defined him, Nkosi's wide felt something he hadn't expected. Not control, not clarity, not even certainty, but something far more complicated, something that didn't belong to strategy, or testing, or distance. He felt involved, and, somewhere deep inside him, a quiet truth began to form. This was no longer about finding a kind woman. It was about one woman, Mpho. And the more he stayed hidden, the more he risked losing her. The higher floors of the Santon complex did not belong to people like Mpho. Even during the night when most of the building emptied into silence, there were still certain areas that carried a different kind of presence. Offices that remained locked, corridors that cleaners were told not to enter unless instructed, glass doors that reflected not just light but power. Mpho had learned to recognize those invisible boundaries quickly. She did not question them. She simply worked around them. Because survival did not leave room for curiosity. That night, however, something shifted in a way she could not see. While she moved quietly between floors, wiping down surfaces and emptying bins far above her in a section of the building she had never been allowed to enter, a meeting was taking place. It was not scheduled in the system. It was not announced. But it mattered more than anything happening below. Inside a wide glass-walled office, 3 figures sat around a polished table, the city lights stretching endlessly behind them. Their posture was relaxed, but their eyes were sharp, calculating, focused, not on the view, but on something far more interesting. A photograph, placed carefully at the center of the table. It was a simple image taken from a distance, slightly blurred, not meant to be seen clearly, but clear enough. A young woman in a faded uniform standing beside a security guard in a dim corridor. Mpho and Mpho, Zanele Kumalo, leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping slowly against the armrest as she studied the image with narrowed eyes. She was used to being the most composed person in any room, the one who never reacted too quickly, never revealed too much. But there was something in the picture that unsettled her in a quiet, controlled way. "This is her?" she asked. Across from her, Mandlovu gave a slow nod. Her presence filled the room without effort, the kind of authority that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. "That is the girl," she said calmly, "the one he has been spending time with." Zanele's gaze returned to the image. "She doesn't look like much." "That is exactly the problem," Mandlovu replied. There was no anger in her tone, only strategy. Zanele tilted her head slightly, considering. "A cleaner," she said. "No connections, no background worth mentioning, no reason to be anywhere near him. And yet, she is," Mandlovu said. Silence settled between them for a moment. Not empty, measured. The kind of silence where decisions began forming long before they were spoken aloud. At the far end of the table, a third man sat quietly observing without interrupting. Mr. Dubé had worked with the Zweid family for years, managing affairs that required discretion rather than visibility. He understood when to speak and when to remain silent. This was not yet a moment for speaking. Zanele leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening. "Do you think he knows what he's doing?" she asked. Mandlovu's lips curved faintly, though there was no warmth in the gesture. "He thinks he does," she said. "And you don't. I think he is forgetting who he is." The words were soft, but heavy. Zanele's fingers stilled. "And this girl," she asked, "what is she to him?" Mandlovu's gaze did not leave the photograph. "Right now," she said, "an experiment, a pause." Soon she added quietly, "A problem." Zanele's eyes flickered with interest. "And problems," she said, "need to be handled early." Mandlovu finally looked up. Their eyes met, and in that moment, no further explanation was needed. They understood each other completely, not through emotion, but through intention. Zanele reached out, sliding the photograph slightly closer to herself. "She looks ordinary," she said again, though this time her tone carried something sharper beneath it. "That makes her dangerous." Mandlovu nodded once. "Ordinary people," she said, "are the easiest to underestimate." Another silence followed. Short, decisive. Then Mandlovu spoke again. "Find out everything about her," she said to Mr. Dubé without turning. "Where she lives, who she takes care of, what she needs." Mr. Dubé inclined his head slightly. "It will be done." Zanele leaned back again, satisfied. "And after that?" she asked. Mandlovu's gaze returned to the city lights. "After that," she said calmly, "we decide how to remove her." The words hung in the air without resistance, because in their world, people like Mpho did not belong, and anything that did not belong was dealt with. Downstairs, Mpho knew none of this. She continued her work as she always did, moving from one task to the next, unaware that her life had just been placed under quiet observation. But something felt different that night. Not enough to name, not enough to understand, just different. She noticed it first in the way people looked at her. Briefly, quickly, then looked away. Not openly hostile, not yet, but not the same as before. At first she ignored it, because she had learned not to chase feelings that had no clear shape. But the feeling did not go away. Later, as she reached for supplies in a storage room, she found Nomsa and Lindewe already inside. Their conversation stopped the moment she entered. The silence was immediate, sharp. Mpho paused for just a second, then continued moving as if nothing had changed. She reached for what she needed, her movements steady, controlled. But as she turned to leave, Nomsa spoke. "You're very quiet these days." Mpho stopped, looked back. "I'm always quiet," she said simply, Lindaway let out a soft laugh. Not that quiet, she replied. Mpho didn't respond. She didn't need to. But the tension lingered, unspoken, watching. When she stepped back into the corridor, she exhaled slowly. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. Something was shifting, and she could feel it, even if she didn't understand why. Across the hallway, Mpho stood where he usually did. But tonight, his attention was divided. Because earlier he had been called, not by name, but by position. A quiet message passed through the system. A request. From upstairs. From people who did not make requests lightly. He had not responded. Not yet. But he knew what it meant. The moment he saw Mpho again, walking toward him with the same quiet strength she carried every night, something tightened inside him. Because for the first time since this began, he was no longer the only one observing, and that changed everything. "You look like you're thinking too much," Mpho said softly as she approached. He blinked slightly, pulled back from his thoughts. "Maybe I am." She gave a small smile. "That's dangerous." He almost smiled in return. "Why?" "Because thinking too much makes you see things you can't fix." Her words were simple, but they landed deeper than she intended. Mpho studied her for a moment, then asked quietly, "And what do you do when that happens?" Mpho shrugged lightly. "You keep going anyway." There was no hesitation in her answer. No doubt, just acceptance. He nodded slowly. But inside, something had already begun to shift. Because this time, keeping things as they were might no longer be enough. As the night stretched on, the distance between what was hidden and what was coming grew thinner. Not visibly. Not yet. But steadily. And somewhere above them, in rooms Mpho would never enter, decisions were already being made. Decisions that would soon reach her. Decisions she would not be prepared for. Because in a world where power moved quietly, the most dangerous battles began, long before anyone realized they had started. The change did not arrive like a storm. It came quietly, like most dangerous things do. At first, it was only small details. A supervisor who used to ignore Mpho now watched her a little too closely. A checklist that suddenly included tasks no one had mentioned before. Supplies that went missing from her station, forcing her to waste time searching while others finished early. None of it was loud enough to protest. None of it was clear enough to accuse. But together, it formed a pattern, and Mpho felt it. She did not complain. She adjusted. Because that was what survival had taught her to do. But inside, a quiet tension began to build, the kind that made even simple movements feel heavier than they should. That night she arrived earlier than usual, hoping to finish more before the supervisors began their rounds. The air felt colder, though nothing in the building had changed. She tied her apron tighter, pushed her cart forward, and began working without hesitation. She had learned that the only way to survive invisible pressure was to become even more invisible, more efficient, more careful, more precise. But even that was no longer enough. Halfway through her shift, she was called to the lower storage room. The message came through one of the assistants, delivered casually as if it meant nothing. "Supervisor wants to see you," the woman said, barely looking at her. Mpho nodded and went. She did not ask why. People like her did not ask why. They waited to be told. Inside the storage room, the fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows across the shelves. The supervisor stood near the center arms, folded, her expression unreadable. Two others were there. Nomza, Lindaway. Mpho paused for just a second before stepping forward. "Yes, ma'am," she said calmly. The supervisor did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked past Mpho toward a table at the side of the room. On it lay a small black wallet, worn but not old, out of place. The supervisor turned back slowly. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. Mpho looked at it, then back at her. "No." It was found in your cleaning cart. The words landed without warning. Not loud, but heavy. Mpho blinked once, processing. That's not mine, she said. Her voice remained steady, not defensive, just certain. Namza let out a soft, disbelieving laugh from the side. Of course it's not, she muttered. Lindaway crossed her arms, watching with quiet interest. The supervisor stepped closer. Inside, she said there was cash, and a key card from one of the executive floors. Mpho's chest tightened slightly, but her face did not change. I didn't take it, she said again. The supervisor studied her. Longer this time, as if looking for something behind the words. And how did it get into your cart? She asked. Mpho did not answer immediately. Because she did not know, and she refused to guess. I don't know, she said finally. That answer did not help her. She could feel it in the way the room shifted, the way silence turned from neutral to accusing. Namsa stepped forward slightly. Maybe you should check her bag too, she suggested. Just in case. Mpho's eyes moved to her. Not angry, not afraid, just aware. Lindaway nodded. Yes, we should be thorough. The supervisor hesitated for a moment, then gestured. Put your bag on the table. Mpho stood still, just for a second, not because she refused, but because something inside her was trying to understand how quickly everything had changed. Then she stepped forward, placed her worn bag on the table, opened it, slowly, carefully. The supervisor searched through it without a word. Clothes, a small container, a folded cloth, nothing else. No money, no keycard, nothing that didn't belong. The supervisor straightened, her expression unreadable again. But the doubt had already been planted, and doubt did not disappear easily. This is serious, she said. Very serious. Mpho nodded once. I understand. Until this is resolved, the supervisor continued. You are suspended from duty. The words came calmly, as if they were routine, as if they did not carry consequences. But for Mpho they did. They carried everything, her income, her brother's medicine, her ability to survive the next week. She felt it, not as panic, but as weight, crushing, quiet, final. Still she did not beg, she did not argue, because something inside her refused to break that way. I didn't take it, she said one last time. The supervisor did not respond, because at that moment truth was no longer the point. Control was. Mpho picked up her bag, turned and walked out. Not quickly, not slowly, just steadily, as if the ground beneath her had not just shifted. Outside the storage room, the corridor felt longer than before. Colder, empty in a way that had nothing to do with people. She kept walking, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean feeling, and feeling would slow her down. She could not afford that, not now. Across the hallway, Mpho stood frozen. He had seen her go in, seen the door close. He had already sensed something was wrong before that. But now watching her walk out, he knew. He stepped forward. Mpho. She stopped, turned, and for the first time since he had met her, something in her expression had changed. Not broken, but distant, as if she had already stepped away from something inside herself. I've been suspended, she said before he could ask. The words were simple, but they carried everything. His jaw tightened. For what they found something in my cart, she replied. Something that wasn't mine. He understood immediately. Not the details, but the truth behind it. Because he knew how these things worked. Because he knew who was capable of making them happen. And because deep down he had already felt it coming. This isn't right, he said quietly. Mpho gave a faint smile. It doesn't have to be right. The calm in her voice unsettled him more than anger would have. Are you going to fight it? He asked. She shook her head. With what? He had no answer, because she was right. Fighting required resources, support, proof, things she did not have. A silence settled between them. Heavy, unavoidable. "My brother needs medicine," she said after a moment, almost to herself. "I was supposed to buy it tomorrow." Mpho felt something tighten in his chest. "I can help," he said. The words came too quickly, too instinctively. Mpho looked at him. Longer this time, not rejecting, but searching. And what she found made her shake her head gently. "No," she said. "Why not? Because if I take help now," she replied softly, "I might start depending on it." Her eyes did not leave his. "And I can't afford to depend on anything that might disappear." The words were not about money. They were about something deeper, something he had not yet given her. Truth. Mpho looked away. Just for a second. Because for the first time, he felt it clearly. The cost of his silence. "I didn't steal it," she added quietly. "I know," he said immediately. She nodded once. Good. That was all she needed. Not proof, not defense, just someone who believed her. "I'll figure something out," she said. Because that was what she always did. She turned, began to walk away. "Mpho." She stopped again, but did not turn this time. "I won't let this stand," he said. The words were low, firm, different. She hesitated, then replied softly without looking back. "Sometimes, things don't need permission to stand." And then, she walked away. Mpho remained where he was, still, silent. But inside him, something had already begun to break. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. Because this time staying hidden was no longer protecting the truth. It was destroying it. And for the first time since he had chosen this path, Nkosi's wide understood something he had been avoiding. If he did nothing now, he would lose her. Not because of who he was, but because of who he had chosen to be. The morning after her suspension did not feel different at first. The same narrow room, the same cracked walls, the same thin mattress beneath Thabo's fragile body, the same early light pushing its way through the broken window. But something invisible had shifted, and Mpho felt it the moment she opened her eyes. For a few seconds she lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to gather herself before the weight of the day fully settled in. Then reality returned all at once, quiet but undeniable. No shift to go to, no wages waiting at the end of the week, no clear way forward. She sat up slowly, pressing her palms together as if grounding herself in something steady. Thabo stirred beside her. "You didn't leave early today," he said, his voice still soft with sleep. Mpho turned to him, forcing a small smile that she hoped looked natural. "I have the day off," she replied. He frowned slightly. "You never have days off." She let out a quiet breath. "Then maybe it's time I start." He studied her face for a moment longer than usual. Thabo had always been observant in ways that made it hard to hide things from him, but he also knew when not to push. "Are you okay?" he asked. Mpho reached out and brushed his hair gently. "I will be," she said. And for now that was enough. She stood tying her scarf loosely around her head, her movements slower than usual. The room felt smaller that morning, not because it had changed, but because her options had. She opened the tin box again, though she already knew what she would find. A few folded notes, coins at the bottom. Not enough. Still not enough. She closed it carefully, as if the act of closing it could somehow preserve what little remained. "I'll go to the market," she said. "Maybe I can find something for today." Thabo nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "Don't stay out too long," he added. "I won't." She stepped outside, and the world moved on as if nothing had happened. The market was already alive with sound and movement. Vendors calling out prices, customers bargaining, children weaving between crowded stalls. The energy of survival filled every corner, sharp and relentless. Mpho moved through it with quiet purpose. She was not there to wander. She was there to find work. Any work. She approached one stall, then another, asking softly if help was needed. Most responses were quick and dismissive. Some didn't even look at her. But she kept going, because stopping was not an option. Eventually, an older woman running a vegetable stall glanced at her more carefully. "You've worked before?" the woman asked. "Yes," Mpho replied. "Cleaning, carrying, anything." The woman nodded slowly. "I need help unloading crates, just for today." "That's fine." The work began immediately. Heavy boxes, repetitive movement. No time to think. Exactly what Mpho needed. She lifted, carried, stacked, wiped sweat from her forehead, and continued without complaint. Her body ached, but she welcomed the ache. It was easier than the weight in her chest. Hours passed. At the end, the woman handed her a small amount of money. Not much, but enough for one day. Mpho accepted it with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." The woman nodded. "You work hard," she said simply. Mpho gave a faint smile. "I have to." Meanwhile, far from the noise of the market, in a quiet office, overlooking the city, Nkosi's wide stood alone. The photograph was still on the table. Mpho. Frozen in a moment she did not know existed. He had not touched it since the meeting, but he had not moved it either, because it reminded him of something he could no longer ignore. A knock sounded at the door. "Come in," he said. Mr. Dubé entered, closing the door behind him. "I have the information you requested," he said. Nkosi did not turn immediately. "Tell me." "She lives in Alexandra," Mr. Dubé began. "Small room, no family support. She takes care of her younger brother Thabo. He is ill, possibly serious." Nkosi's jaw tightened. How serious enough that he requires medical attention they cannot afford? Silence followed. Not empty, heavy. Mr. Dubé continued. "She has no record of misconduct, no criminal activity, no history of theft. The accusation against her was arranged." Nkosi turned then. His eyes were calm, but something beneath them had changed. "By whom?" he asked. Mr. Dubé hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "Mandlovu and Miss Kumalo." Nkosi said nothing, because he already knew. "Do you want me to intervene?" Mr. Dubé asked carefully. Nkosi looked back at the photograph. "No," he said at first, then paused and added quietly, "Not yet." Mr. Dubé nodded, but his expression carried something unspoken, concern, because he understood what Nkosi was doing, and he understood the cost. "Keep watching," Nkosi said. Mr. Dubé inclined his head. "It will be done." He left. The door closed softly behind him. Nkosi remained still, alone again, but not untouched, because this time the distance he had created between himself and the world was no longer protecting him. It was forcing him to watch something he could not control. Back at the market, Mpho finished her work and made her way home, the small amount of money held carefully in her hand. It was not enough, but it was something. She stopped briefly at a roadside pharmacy, asking about the medicine Thabo needed. The price was higher than what she carried. She nodded, thanked the man, and stepped away. Not disappointed, just aware. When she reached home, Thabo was awake, sitting up slightly, a book resting loosely in his hands. "You look tired," he said. Mpho smiled. "That means I worked." He nodded. "That's good." She sat beside him, placing a small packet of food on the table. "Eat first," she said. "Then we'll figure out the rest." He looked at her, carefully. "You didn't go back to the building," he said. It wasn't a question. Mpho paused, then shook her head. "No." Why? She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to tell him, but because she didn't want to make it real. They said I did something I didn't do, she said finally. Thabo's hands tightened slightly around the book. But you didn't. No. Then why would they say that? Mpho let out a quiet breath. Sometimes people don't need a reason. Thabo was silent for a moment. Then he spoke again. Will you go back? Mpho looked at him. Then away. I don't know. And that was the truth. As night fell, the city lights flickered on one by one, and somewhere within them, paths were beginning to shift. Unseen, unspoken, but inevitable. Because Mpho was not the kind of person who gave up, and Nkosi was no longer the kind of man who could stand still. Between them, something was changing. Not loudly, not yet, but enough. Enough to move the story forward. Enough to bring everything closer to the moment where truth could no longer stay hidden. By the third day after her suspension, Mpho had already learned something she had always feared, but never fully faced. Hardship did not arrive in a single blow. It stretched itself across days, across choices, across small decisions that slowly closed every door, until even breathing felt like something that required effort. The first day had been filled with movement, with searching, with the fragile hope that something would change if she kept trying. The second day had been quieter, more deliberate, as if she had begun adjusting to a reality she did not yet accept. But by the third day, the weight of it all settled into something deeper, something harder to push against because it no longer felt temporary. That morning, Thabo's coughing did not stop. It came in long, exhausting waves that bent his small frame forward, stealing his breath and leaving him weak in a way that frightened Mpho, more than she allowed herself to show. She sat beside him, one hand pressed gently against his back, counting the seconds between each breath as if she could somehow control the rhythm of his body by staying present. We need to go back to the clinic, she said softly. Thabo shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. They'll ask for money again, he managed. I know, she replied. Then why go? Mpho hesitated because the answer was not simple. It was not about logic or certainty. It was about refusing to do nothing. Because doing nothing is worse, she said quietly. He looked at her, and in that moment he understood. Not because the situation made sense, but because she always chose to keep moving, even when movement felt pointless. By midday they were at the clinic again, sitting among dozens of others who carried the same quiet desperation in their eyes. The room was crowded, the air heavy, the waiting endless. When Mpho's turn finally came, the nurse barely looked up before asking the same question she had heard before. Do you have money for the tests? Mpho held Thabo's hand tighter. Not yet, she said. The nurse sighed, not unkindly, but without patience. Then there's nothing more we can do today. The words were simple, routine, spoken countless times before. But for Mpho they landed like something final. She nodded, thanked the nurse, and stood up without argument. Not because she accepted it, but because she had learned that sometimes resistance only wasted the little energy she had left. Outside the clinic, Thabo walked more slowly than usual. Mpho adjusted her pace without thinking, staying close enough to support him if needed. I'm sorry, he said after a while. Mpho stopped, turned to him. For what? For making things harder. Her expression changed immediately. Don't say that, she said firmly, more firmly than she intended. He lowered his eyes. But it's true. No, she replied, her voice softer now but still steady. What's happening to you is not your fault, and taking care of you is not a burden. He looked at her again, searching her face for doubt. He did not find any, and that was what made her words real. They walked home in silence after that, but it was not a heavy silence. It was the kind that came from understanding, from knowing that even in the middle of uncertainty, they still had each other. That evening, as Thabo rested, Mpho sat by the small window staring out at the fading light. Her mind moved through possibilities, through options that grew fewer, the longer she considered them. Returning to the building felt impossible. Finding stable work in time to help Thabo felt unlikely. Borrowing money was not an option. There was no one left to ask. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to ask a question she usually avoided. What if she could not fix this? The thought did not break her, but it stayed. At that same moment in a part of the city where problems were solved before they could grow, Zanele Kumalo sat in a quiet lounge, her phone resting lightly in her hand as she reviewed a series of messages. Each one contained updates, small pieces of information that on their own meant very little. But together, they formed a clear picture. Mpho had not returned to work. Mpho had no support. Mpho was struggling. Zanele leaned back slightly, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were observing something from a distance, rather than influencing it directly. Across from her, Mandlovu watched without speaking. "Well," she asked after a moment. Zanele's lips curved faintly. "She's exactly what we expected," she said. "Resilient, but isolated." Mandlovu nodded once, "And that makes her easier to control." Zanele tilted her head slightly. "Or easier to break," she added. There was no cruelty in her tone, only clarity, and Nkosi Mandlovu asked. Zanelle's expression sharpened just enough to reveal her interest. "He hasn't acted," she said, "which means he's still holding on to his little experiment." Mandlovu's gaze shifted toward the window. "He won't hold forever," she said quietly. "No," Zanele agreed. "He won't." A pause followed, not long but deliberate. Then Zanele leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just enough to signal intention. "It's time to push further," she said. Mandlovu did not ask what she meant. She already knew. The next morning, Mpho returned to the market again. Her steps steady, her expression composed, despite the exhaustion she could no longer fully hide. She worked where she could, lifting, carrying, doing anything that would bring in even the smallest amount of money. But this time something was different. Opportunities were fewer. Responses were colder. At one stall where she had worked just the day before, the same woman who had paid her now avoided her eyes. "I don't need help today," the woman said, quickly before Mpho could even ask. Mpho nodded. "All right." She moved on. Another stall, another refusal. Not harsh, not obvious, but consistent. By midday the pattern was clear. Something had changed, and it was not by accident. Mpho stood at the edge of the market, watching the movement around her, trying to understand what she could not see. She had done nothing different, said nothing wrong, and yet doors that had been slightly open before were now closed. For a moment she considered going back to the building. Not to beg, not to argue, but to ask, to understand. Then she remembered the look in the supervisor's eyes, the certainty, the decision already made. And she knew that door was not just closed, it was locked. Far away from behind tinted glass, Nkosi's wide watched a screen without really seeing it. Reports, numbers, projections all moved across the display. But his focus was somewhere else entirely. On a different screen, one that showed something much simpler. Mpho, standing alone at the edge of a crowded market, surrounded by people but untouched by them. He had not planned for this. Not like this. He had wanted truth, clarity, proof of character. But what he was seeing now was something else entirely. Consequence. And for the first time, the distance he had carefully created between himself and the world no longer felt like control. It felt like failure. His hand moved slightly as if he were about to give an order, then stopped, because he knew that whatever he did next would change everything. By the time the fourth day came, Mpho no longer expected things to improve. Not because she had lost hope, but because she had learned to stop tying hope to immediate results. Survival for her had never been about waiting for things to get better. It had always been about continuing, even when nothing changed. Still, the weight of everything she was carrying had begun to settle deeper into her body, into the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she paused, just a little longer, before making decisions that once came easily. That morning, Thabo could not get out of bed. His breathing was uneven again, his chest rising too fast, too shallow, as if each breath required more effort than the last. Mpho sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, her eyes fixed on his face as though she could read something there that would tell her what to do next. "We should go back," she said quietly. Thabo shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "It won't change anything." Mpho did not respond immediately. She knew he was right, but she also knew that doing nothing felt like surrender, and surrender was something she had never allowed herself. "It might," she said finally, though the words carried less certainty than before. He looked at her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Not fear, not pain, but acceptance. The kind that came too early for someone his age. "You don't have to pretend for me," he said softly. Mpho forced a small smile. "I'm not pretending." But this time even she could hear the difference. By midday, she made a decision she had been avoiding. She would go back to the building. Not because she believed they would welcome her. Not because she expected justice. But because she needed to stand in front of what had happened and face it instead of letting it exist as something distant and unresolved. She left Thabo resting and walked toward Santon with steady steps, her mind quiet in a way that only came when there were no options left to consider. The building looked the same as always, clean, untouched, unaware. Mpho stood outside for a moment, watching people move in and out dressed in clothes that spoke of stability and certainty. Then she stepped forward. Inside, nothing had changed. And yet everything had. She could feel it in the way the receptionist glanced at her just briefly before looking away. In the way, a passing employee slowed down for half a second, as if recognizing her, then continued walking without acknowledgement. She approached the desk calmly. "I would like to speak to the supervisor," she said. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. "Wait there." Mpho stepped aside, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture steady. Minutes passed, then the supervisor appeared. The same expression, the same measured gaze. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Mpho met her eyes. "I came to ask about the accusation," she said. "And to tell you again that I didn't take anything." The supervisor's face did not change. "That has already been addressed," she replied. "It hasn't," Mpho said quietly. "Not for me." A brief silence followed. Then the supervisor sighed, not out of frustration, but out of finality. "There is no evidence to clear you," she said. "And no reason to continue this discussion." Mpho absorbed the words without reacting. "Then there is no evidence that I did it." "Either," she replied. The supervisor's gaze sharpened slightly. "That is not how this works." Mpho nodded once. "I understand." Another pause. Then with quiet resolve she added, "But I needed to say it again. Not for you, for myself." The supervisor did not respond. Because there was nothing left to say, Mpho turned and walked away. Not defeated, not victorious, just clear. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter, but more defined, as if something inside her had settled into place. She had faced it, and now she could move forward, even if forward meant uncertainty. Across the building, hidden behind layers of glass and distance, Nkosi had been watching. Not directly, but enough. Enough to see her walk in, enough to see her walk out, and enough to understand what had just happened. He felt it then fully without resistance. The weight of his silence. the consequences of his choice. He had wanted to see who she was without influence, without interference. But now he had seen something else. Who she was when the world turned against her. And the answer had not comforted him. It had unsettled him. Because she had not broken, she had not begged, she had not changed, and that made everything he had done feel wrong. Later that evening, as the city shifted back into its nighttime rhythm, Mpho returned to the streets near the complex. Not to work, not anymore, but because part of her still felt connected to that place, to the hours she had spent there, to the quiet conversations, to him. She did not expect to see Mpho. And yet when she turned the corner near the side entrance, he was there, standing in the same place, as if nothing had changed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mpho stepped closer. "I went inside today," she said. He nodded. "I know." She frowned slightly. "How?" He hesitated, then answered simply, "I heard." She accepted that, even though something about it felt incomplete. "They won't change their decision," she said. "I know." Another silence, short but heavy. Mpho looked at him carefully. "You knew this would happen," she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a realization. Mpho's expression tightened slightly. "What do you mean?" She held his gaze. "I don't know how," she said slowly, "but you're not surprised." He did not respond because he couldn't, not without revealing something he was not ready to reveal. Mpho exhaled softly. "It's okay," she added. "You don't have to explain." That made it worse, because her acceptance felt like distance. "My brother is getting worse," she said after a moment. The words came quietly, but they carried urgency. Mpho felt it immediately. "Take him to a hospital," he said. "I tried, and they asked for money." He looked away briefly, then back at her. "I can help." This time his voice was firmer, less careful, more certain. Mpho studied him. Longer than before. "You keep saying that," she said, "because I mean it. I know you do." A pause, then she shook her head gently. "But meaning something and being able to carry it are not the same." The words were not cruel, but they were honest, and they landed deeply. Mpho stepped closer. "I won't disappear," he said. Mpho's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained steady. "You don't know that," she replied. Silence followed, because she was right, even if she didn't know how right. "I trust you," she added quietly. The words surprised him. "But I don't trust the world around you." That was the difference. For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them, filled with things unsaid, things unresolved. Then Mpho took a step back. "I have to go," she said. He nodded slowly. "Okay." She turned, walked away. This time she did not look back. And Mpho did not call her name, because something had shifted. Not broken, not ended, but changed. And for the first time since he had met her, Nkosi's wide understood something he could no longer ignore. If he waited any longer, he would not just lose her trust, he would lose her completely. That night did not end when Mpho walked away. It followed Nkosi, into the silence, into the space he had carefully built to protect himself from exactly this kind of complication. For years he had believed distance was clarity, that if he removed himself from wealth, from expectation, from the noise of people who wanted something from him, he would finally see truth in its purest form. He had believed that stepping down into a simpler life would give him control over what mattered. But now, standing alone in the dim corridor long after his shift had technically ended, he understood something he had refused to accept. Distance did not remove consequences. It only delayed them, and now they had arrived. Not as a problem to solve, but as a person he could not ignore. Mpho. The next morning, Nkosi did something he had not done since this began. He returned to his real office. Not as Mpho, not as a guard, but as Nkosi's wide. The building felt different when he entered through the front again, dressed in a tailored suit, acknowledged immediately by staff who moved with quiet urgency around him. Doors opened without question. Conversations paused. Eyes followed. Power had a presence, and he had stepped back into it. But this time it did not feel like control. It felt like responsibility. Inside the executive floor, the atmosphere shifted the moment he appeared. Assistants moved faster, voices lowered, and within minutes, word had reached Mandlovu and Zanele. They did not come immediately, because they knew he would not leave. Nkosi stood near the window of his office, looking out over the city he had once managed without hesitation. From this height, everything looked small, manageable, distant. But he knew better now, because the one thing that mattered most to him at that moment was not visible from here. The door opened without a knock. Mandlovu entered first, her posture composed, her expression calm. Zanele followed, her presence controlled but sharp, her eyes immediately scanning Nkosi, as if measuring what had changed. "You decided to come back," Mandlovu said. Nkosi did not turn immediately. "Yes." Zanele crossed her arms lightly. That didn't take long. Nkosi turned, then meeting their gaze without hesitation. "This ends now," he said. The simplicity of his tone made the words heavier. Zanele raised an eyebrow. "What exactly ends?" He held her eyes. "This," he said. "The games, the interference, everything you've done to her." Silence settled in the room. Not shocked, not defensive, just aware. Mandlovu stepped forward slightly. "You're speaking as if we've done something wrong," she said calmly. Nkosi's expression did not change. "You framed her," he replied. Zanele let out a soft breath, almost amused. "She was a cleaner," she said. "She'll find another job." Nkosi's gaze shifted to her. "And if she doesn't, who asked?" Zanele tilted her head slightly. "Then that's unfortunate." The lack of emotion in her voice made something inside him tighten. "You don't get to decide what happens to her," Nkosi said. Mandlovu's eyes narrowed just slightly. "And you do?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Yes." The word was quiet, but absolute. For a moment, no one spoke, because what had just been said was not about Mpho. It was about control, and control had always belonged to Mandlovu, until now. Zanele stepped forward, her voice sharper. "Let's be clear," she said. "You chose to step away from this company. You chose to play whatever game you were playing. We simply made sure it didn't get out of hand." Nkosi's jaw tightened. "You tried to destroy her." "We removed a distraction," Zanele corrected. He shook his head slowly. "She's not a distraction." Zanele's eyes flickered. "Then what is she?" she asked. Nkosi did not hesitate. "She's someone who deserves the truth." The words hung in the air, heavy, irreversible. Mandlovu studied him carefully. "You're forgetting something," she said. "Who you are." Nkosi took a step closer. "No," he replied quietly. "I'm finally remembering." The room shifted, not visibly, but completely. Because this was no longer a disagreement, it was a turning point. "I want everything reversed," Nkosi said. "Her suspension, the accusation, all of it." Zanele let out a small laugh. "You can't undo what's already been done." Nkosi's eyes hardened. "I can." Mandlovu's voice remained calm. "And if we refuse," Nkosi did not look away, "then I take this public." That changed everything. Zanele's posture straightened. "You wouldn't." "I would." Mandlovu's gaze deepened, and risk the company. Nkosi's answer came without hesitation. "If that's what it takes." Silence filled the room again. But this time it was different, because for the first time, Mandlovu saw something in him she had not expected. Not rebellion, not emotion, but certainty. She stepped back slightly, studying him, then nodded once. "Fine," she said. Zanele turned to her. "You can't be serious." Mandlovu did not look at her. "This is not the moment to push," she said quietly. Zanele's frustration was clear, but she said nothing more. Nkosi exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in decision, because this was only the beginning. "Mr. Dube will handle the correction," Mandlovu added. Nkosi nodded. "And the hospital," he said. Mandlovu's eyes flickered briefly. "What about it?" "Her brother needs treatment." Zanele shook her head. "This is getting out of hand." Nkosi did not look at her. "I'm not asking." Another pause. Then Mandlovu spoke. "It will be arranged." The meeting ended without another word. But nothing about it was simple, because something had shifted that could not be undone. Later that day, far from the glass offices and controlled conversations, Mpho sat beside Thabo again, watching his breathing with the same quiet focus she had carried for days. There was a knock at the door. Soft, unexpected. Mpho frowned slightly, then stood. When she opened it, a man stood outside, well-dressed, composed, out of place. "Miss Mpho Dlamini?" he asked. She hesitated. "Yes. My name is Dube," he said. "I've come regarding your brother." Her heart tightened. "What about him?" He stepped slightly to the side. A vehicle waited behind him. "We'd like to take him to a private hospital," he said calmly. "His treatment will be covered." Mpho stared at him, not understanding why she asked. Mr. Dube met her gaze. "Because it should have been done sooner." She stood there, the weight of the moment, pressing in from all sides. Nothing about it made sense, nothing connected. And yet, it was real. Behind her, Thabo coughed again, struggling. Mpho closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them, and made a choice. "Give me a moment," she said. As she stepped back inside, her mind moved quickly, trying to catch up with something that had already begun. Because somewhere beyond what she could see, someone had acted, and she was about to find out who. The drive to the private hospital felt unreal to Mpho, not because of the distance or the unfamiliar streets they passed, but because of how quickly everything had changed without explanation. Just hours earlier, she had been sitting in a small room, with no clear path forward, counting coins and measuring hope in fragile pieces. Now she was seated in the back of a quiet vehicle, holding Thabo's hand as he leaned weakly against her shoulder, while a man she had never met spoke calmly about treatment arrangements and care, as if such things were normal. Mpho did not ask many questions during the drive, not because she didn't have them, but because she had learned that sometimes answers arrived slowly, and asking too early only made confusion heavier. Instead, she focused on Thabo, on the rhythm of his breathing, on the way his fingers tightened slightly around hers each time the car slowed or turned. When they arrived, the difference between this place and the clinic was immediate and undeniable. The air was cleaner, the space quieter, the movement more controlled. There were no long lines stretching out the door, no exhausted faces waiting without certainty, no hurried dismissals. Instead, a nurse was already waiting for them, prepared, attentive, as if they had been expected. Thabo was taken in, gently, without delay, without questions about payment, without the hesitation Mpho had grown used to. That alone felt like something she could not fully process. "Please wait here," the nurse said kindly, guiding Mpho to a seat in a quiet corridor. "The doctor will speak to you shortly." Mpho nodded, her eyes following Thabo until he disappeared through a set of doors. Only then did she sit down, her hands resting in her lap, her body still but her mind moving quickly through everything that had led to this moment. None of it made sense. Not yet, and yet she could not ignore the one truth that stood above all confusion. Thabo was finally receiving help. That was enough for now. Time passed slowly in the waiting area, each minute stretching longer than it should. Mpho kept her eyes on the floor for a while, then lifted them occasionally, observing the quiet order of the place, the way people moved with purpose but without urgency. It felt like a different world, one she had only ever seen from a distance. After what felt like both a long time and no time at all, the doctor approached her. "Are you Thabo's sister?" he asked. "Yes," Mpho replied, standing immediately. The doctor nodded. "He's stable for now," he said, "but his condition is more serious than it should have been at this stage. We'll need to run several tests and begin treatment immediately." Mpho absorbed the words carefully. "Will he be okay?" she asked. The doctor hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of honesty. "He has a good chance," he said, "but we'll need to act quickly." Mpho nodded. "Do whatever you need to do." The doctor studied her for a moment. "It will be expensive," he added as if out of habit. Mpho held his gaze. "I was told it would be covered." The doctor's expression shifted slightly. "Yes," he said. "That's correct." After he left, Mpho sat back down slowly. Covered. The word stayed in her mind. Heavy. Unfamiliar. Because nothing in her life had ever been simply covered. Everything had always come with a cost, a trade, a condition. She turned her head slightly and saw Mr. Doob standing at the far end of the corridor, speaking quietly on his phone. He looked composed, unaffected, as if this entire situation was routine. Mpho watched him for a moment, then stood and walked toward him. He ended the call as she approached. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Mpho stopped in front of him. "You said this should have been done sooner," she said. "Yes." Why Mr. Dube did not answer immediately? Because the question was not simple, and the answer would change things. Mpho held his gaze. "Who sent you?" she asked. This time there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just clarity. Mr. Doob considered his response carefully, then spoke. "Someone who believes you deserve better than what happened to you." Mpho's expression did not change. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." A brief silence passed between them. Then Mpho asked the question that mattered most. "Is it him?" Mr. Doob looked at her, not surprised, because he had expected it. Who, he asked, though he already knew. Mpho's voice softened slightly. Mpho. The name hung between them, simple, unassuming, and completely separate from the truth. Mr. Doob exhaled quietly, then nodded. "Yes." Mpho's chest tightened, not from shock, but from realization. Because something about this fit, not perfectly, but enough. She looked down briefly, then back up. "He told me he would help," she said. Mr. Dube said nothing, because there was nothing to correct. Not yet. Mpho's thoughts moved quickly now, connecting pieces that had not made sense before. The quiet certainty in Mpho's voice. The way he had spoken not as someone offering hope, but as someone who already knew what would happen. The calm behind his words. It had not been a promise. It had been a decision. "Where is he?" she asked. Mr. Dube hesitated. Because this was the moment where truth began to surface. And once it did, it could not be taken back. "He's working," he said carefully. Mpho nodded slowly. Of course he was. Still in that same place. Still wearing the same uniform. Still standing in the same corridor. But something inside her shifted. Not suspicion. Not doubt. Something else. Something deeper. "Thank you," she said quietly. Mr. Dube inclined his head. You should thank him. Mpho gave a faint smile. I will. She turned and walked back toward the waiting area, her steps slower now, her thoughts heavier but clearer. Because for the first time since everything had started to fall apart, something had been set right. But beneath that relief, another feeling began to form. Not strong, not fully defined, but present. A question. If Mpho could do this, if he could arrange something this big, this quickly, this completely, then who was he, really? Mpho sat down again, her eyes fixed on the doors that led to Thabo's room, but her mind no longer entirely there. Because something had begun. Something that would not stay hidden much longer, and somewhere across the city, standing in a place where truth could no longer be delayed, Nkosi's Wide prepared himself for what came next. Not as Mpho, not as a guard, but as the man he had been all along. Because the time for silence was ending. By the time evening settled over Johannesburg, the city carried a different kind of energy, one that moved quietly beneath the lights and glass towers, where decisions made behind closed doors began to surface in ways no one could fully control. For Mpho, however, the world had narrowed to a single corridor, a single room, and the steady, fragile rhythm of her brother's breathing, as machines now assisted what his body could no longer manage on its own. She sat beside him, her fingers lightly wrapped around his hand, her eyes, tracing every small movement as if memorizing it, could somehow keep him safe. The hospital room was clean, calm, almost too calm, compared to everything she had known before. And yet the silence carried its own weight, one that pressed gently but constantly against her thoughts. Thabo stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering before opening just enough to recognize her. "You're still here," he whispered. Mpho leaned closer, her voice soft but steady. "Of course I am." He studied her face for a moment, then glanced around the room, taking in the unfamiliar space. "This place. It's different," he said. "It is," she replied. "Did you pay for this?" The question came simply without suspicion, but it carried a truth Mpho could no longer ignore. "No," she said after a brief pause. Then who did Mpho hesitated because answering that question meant stepping closer to something she did not yet understand. "Someone helped," she said. Thabo's gaze sharpened slightly despite his weakness. Mpho looked at him surprised. "Why do you say that?" Thabo gave a faint, tired smile. "Because you talk about him like he's the only one who would." The words settled quietly between them, and for a moment Mpho did not respond because she realized that in all her careful thinking, in all her attempts to stay grounded in reality, she had already begun to trust Mpho in a way she had not intended. "Yes," she said finally. "It was him." Thabo nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense in a way nothing else had. "You should thank him properly," he murmured before his eyes closed again, his body slipping back into rest. Mpho remained where she was watching him until his breathing steadied once more. But her thoughts had already begun to move beyond the room, beyond the hospital, toward the man who had changed everything, without explanation. She could not stay there any longer. Not without answers. Later that night, after confirming with the nurse that Thabo would be monitored closely, Mpho stepped out of the hospital and into the cool evening air. The city lights stretched around her bright and distant, but her path was already clear in her mind. She needed to find him, not tomorrow, not later, now. The Santon complex stood as it always had, unchanged, unmoved by the lives that passed through it. Mpho approached from the side entrance, the one she had used during her shifts, her steps steady despite the uncertainty building inside her. For a brief moment she wondered if he would even be there, if everything had already shifted beyond her reach. But as she turned the corner, she saw him, standing in the same place, wearing the same uniform as if nothing had changed. Mpho noticed her immediately. Not because she called out, but because something in the air shifted the moment she arrived. He turned. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Because this time the silence carried more than familiarity. It carried truth, waiting to be uncovered. Mpho stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away from him. "I went to the hospital," she said. He nodded. "I know." She frowned slightly. "You always know." The words were not accusatory, but they were no longer unaware. Mpho did not respond immediately, because he understood that this moment was different from all the others. There would be no quiet deflection, no simple answers. "My brother is receiving treatment," Mpho continued. "Everything is covered." Another nod. "Yes." She held his gaze. "You did that." It was not a question. Mpho exhaled slowly. "Yes." Mpho's chest tightened slightly, but her expression remained steady. How, she asked. The question was simple, but the answer was not. Mpho looked at her, really looked at her as if trying to measure whether this was the moment to let everything fall into place or the moment to hold on just a little longer. But he already knew. There was no more time. "Not as Mpho," he said quietly. The words landed gently, but they carried a weight that shifted the ground beneath her. Mpho did not move, did not react immediately. She simply waited. "My name is Nkosi's wide," he continued. "I own this building, and more." The world did not stop. The city did not go silent. But for Mpho, everything narrowed into a single point of understanding that did not fully settle all at once. She looked at him, at the uniform, at the man she thought she knew. And then, beyond that, "You're lying," she said softly. Not because she believed it, but because the truth was too large to accept in a single moment. "I'm not," he replied. Silence stretched between them. Long, heavy, unavoidable. Mpho took a step back, not out of fear, but out of distance, as if she needed space to see him clearly. "All this time," she said slowly, her voice quieter now, more controlled, "you knew everything. You watched everything, and you said nothing." Nkosi did not deny it. "Yes." The simplicity of his answer made it worse. "Why?" she asked. And this time, the question carried everything. Nkosi held her gaze. "Because I needed to know who you were," he said. "Without influence, without pressure, without everything that comes with my name." Mpho's expression did not change, but something inside her did. "So I was a test," she said. "No," he replied quickly. "You became more than that." She shook her head slightly. "But it started that way." Nkosi hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The truth settled, not loudly, but completely. Mpho let out a slow breath. And for the first time since she had known him, her voice carried something different. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. "You let them accuse me," she said. Nkosi's expression tightened. "I didn't know it would go that far, but it did." Another silence. "My brother was getting worse," she continued. "And you watched. I was trying to understand. You were trying to understand me." She interrupted gently, not harshly but firmly. "While I was trying to survive." The words did not attack. They revealed. Nkosi stepped forward slightly. "I fixed it," he said. "Yes," she replied. "You did." She looked at him again. "Not at Mpho, at Nkosi. But you fixed something you allowed to happen," she added. That was the moment everything changed. Not because of what was said, but because of what could not be undone. Mpho took another step back. "I trusted you," she said quietly. Nkosi felt it then, fully, not as a realization, but as consequence. "I still do," she added, surprising him. "But I don't understand you anymore." She turned slowly. I need time, she said, and then she walked away. This time there was no hesitation, no looking back. Nkosi remained where he was, not calling her, not stopping her, because he knew this was the cost. Not of who he was, but of who he had chosen to be. And for the first time, power could not fix what truth had broken. The night after the truth came out did not bring clarity. It brought distance. Not the physical kind, because Johannesburg remained the same, its lights stretching across the horizon, its streets filled with movement and sound. But something inside Mpho had shifted into a quieter space, one where every thought moved more slowly, more carefully, as if rushing would only make things harder to understand. She did not return to the building the next day. She did not try to see Nkosi. Instead, she went back to the hospital, because that was the one place where her presence still had meaning that did not need explanation. Thabo was awake when she arrived, his breathing steadier than before, his eyes clearer, though still tired. The treatment had begun to work slowly, carefully, just as the doctor had promised. "You look different," Thabo said as she sat beside him. Mpho gave a faint smile. How he studied her for a moment. "Like you're thinking about something heavy." She did not deny it. "I am." He shifted slightly, wincing just a little before settling again. "Is it about him?" Mpho looked at him. "You already know," Thabo shrugged lightly. "You didn't have to say it." She exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to him. "He's not who I thought he was," she said. Thabo nodded. "Is that bad?" Mpho hesitated. "It depends," she replied. "On what? On whether the truth changes what was real." Thabo frowned slightly, trying to follow her meaning. "Did he lie to you?" "Yes," she said. "About everything about who he is." Thabo was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that mattered most. "Did he lie about how he treated you?" Mpho's answer came more slowly this time. "No." "Then maybe not everything was a lie," Thabo said. His words were simple, but they settled into her thoughts in a way that made them harder to ignore. She did not respond immediately, because part of her understood what he meant even if another part resisted it. Sometimes she said quietly, "The truth matters more than how something feels." Thabo looked at her carefully. And sometimes he replied, "How someone treats you is the truth." Mpho fell silent, because she did not have an easy answer to that. Across the city, Nkosi had not slept. Not properly. The conversation from the night before had stayed with him, replaying in quiet fragments that did not fade with time. Every word Mpho had spoken had been calm, controlled, and clear, and that made them impossible to dismiss or reinterpret. He had not lost her in anger. He had lost her in understanding, and that was harder to fix. By morning, he was back in his office, not because he wanted to be there, but because he knew that stepping fully into his role was no longer optional. The decisions he had avoided were now in front of him, and they demanded action that could not be delayed. Mr. Dubé stood across from him, a file in his hand. "The internal report is ready," he said. Nkosi nodded. "Go on." The accusation against Mpho has been traced back to instructions given through Mandlovu's office, executed by 2 employees on the night shift. There is evidence to support it. Nkosi's expression did not change, but something in his posture became more defined. "And the employees?" he asked. "They've been suspended pending further action." Nkosi shook his head slightly. "That's not enough." Mr. Dubé waited. "What do you want done?" Nkosi's voice remained calm. "Everything goes public." Mr. Dubé's eyes lifted slightly. "Are you certain?" "Yes." "There will be consequences," Mr. Dubé said carefully. "For the company, for your family." Nkosi held his gaze. "There are already consequences," he replied. The room fell quiet, because there was nothing left to argue. Later that day, the announcement moved through the company like a controlled shock wave. Not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. Internal communications were sent, meetings were called, and within hours the narrative that had quietly pushed Mpho out began to unravel in front of everyone who had accepted it without question. Names were mentioned, actions were clarified, responsibility was assigned. And for the first time since the accusation had been made, the truth was no longer something hidden in quiet conversations. It was visible. Mpho heard about it in the hospital. Not directly, but through a nurse who had been speaking to a colleague nearby, unaware that the woman sitting quietly by the window was the center of the story they were discussing. "They're saying it was staged," the nurse said, her voice low but clear enough to carry. "That the girl was innocent the whole time." Her colleague shook her head. "That kind of thing happens more than people think." Mpho did not move, did not react, but the words settled into her one by one until they formed something she could no longer ignore. She stood slowly, her steps measured as she moved toward the corridor, her mind already piecing together what this meant. Nkosi had acted, not quietly, not carefully, but completely. That evening, as the sun began to set, Mpho found herself walking again, not toward the market, not toward uncertainty, but toward something she had not yet decided how to face. The building stood ahead of her, the same as always, and yet not the same at all, because now she knew what it represented. Not just work, not just survival, but truth. Inside, the atmosphere was different, subtle but clear. People spoke more carefully, looked at each other with a kind of awareness that had not been there before. And when Mpho stepped through the entrance, the reaction was immediate, though controlled. Conversations paused. Eyes followed her, not with judgment this time, but with something closer to recognition. She did not stop, did not hesitate. She moved through the space with the same quiet strength she had always carried. Nkosi was waiting, not in the corridor where Mpho had once stood, but in the open space near the center of the building. No uniform, no disguise, no distance. When Mpho saw him, she slowed, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding. They stood facing each other, the space between them, filled with everything that had happened and everything that remained unresolved. "You made it public," she said. Nkosi nodded. "Yes." Why he did not look away. "Because it was the truth," he replied. Mpho studied him. "And now?" "Now," he said, "it's your choice." She tilted her head slightly. "My choice." "Yes. About what? About whether any of this can still mean something," he said. The words were not a request, not a demand, but something in between. Mpho took a slow breath. "You did what was right," she said. Nkosi did not respond, because he knew that was not the same as forgiveness. "But that doesn't change what happened," she continued. "I know, and it doesn't change how it felt," she added. "I know." Silence settled again, but this time it was not heavy. It was open. Mpho looked at him, really looked at him, not as Mpho, not as Nkosi, but as both at once. "I'm not the same person I was before this," she said. Nkosi nodded. "Neither am I." That was the truth. Simple, unavoidable. Mpho exhaled slowly. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "That's okay," Nkosi said. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. Not in agreement, not in resolution, but in acknowledgement. Because some things did not need to be decided immediately. They only needed to be faced. And for the first time since everything had begun to fall apart, Mpho felt something she had not allowed herself to feel before. Not certainty, not peace, but possibility. And sometimes, that was enough to begin again. The days that followed did not rush toward resolution. They unfolded slowly with a quiet weight that made every decision feel deliberate, as if both Mpho and Nkosi understood that whatever came next could not be built on urgency or emotion alone. The truth had already been revealed. The injustice had already been corrected. But what remained between them was something far more fragile than either of those things. Trust. And trust, once shaken, did not return, simply because the right actions had been taken. Mpho spent most of her time at the hospital. Thabo's condition had stabilized enough for him to sit up to speak more comfortably and to smile in a way that no longer felt forced. The doctors, moved with quiet confidence, now adjusting treatment, explaining progress, and for the first time, offering something that felt like certainty rather than possibility. Each improvement brought relief, but it also brought space. And in that space, Mpho found herself thinking again, not about survival, not about the next step, but about everything that had happened and what it meant moving forward. She did not avoid Nkosi, but she did not seek him out either, because she knew that whatever came next could not be decided in a single conversation. It had to grow, or not grow at all, not grow. Nkosi, on the other hand, did not allow himself the same distance. For the first time in years, he stepped fully into his role without hesitation, not because he had rediscovered ambition, but because he understood that responsibility was no longer something he could step away from when it became uncomfortable. The company had begun to shift under his direction. Policies were reviewed. Internal structures were questioned. Decisions that had once been made quietly were now brought into the open, not as a reaction, but as a correction. Mandlovu remained present, but her influence had changed. She no longer moved with the same certainty, no longer assumed that control would go unquestioned. Zanele, too, had withdrawn slightly her strategies, no longer as effective in a space where transparency had replaced quiet manipulation. But neither of them had disappeared, and Nkosi knew they wouldn't, because power did not leave easily. It adapted. One afternoon, as Mpho sat beside Thabo's bed, a nurse entered with a small smile. "You have a visitor," she said. Mpho looked up, slightly surprised. "I didn't expect anyone." The nurse stepped aside, and Nkosi walked in. For a moment, the room held its breath, not because his presence demanded attention, but because of what it represented. Not a god, not a stranger, but someone who now stood fully in his own identity. Mpho did not stand immediately. She simply watched him, taking in the difference, the absence of disguise, the presence of truth. Nkosi stepped closer, his movements calm, his expression open in a way that carried no defense. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. Mpho shook her head slightly. "No." Thabo looked between them, his curiosity clear despite his tiredness. "You're not wearing your uniform," he said. Nkosi gave a small, genuine smile. "No," he replied. "I'm not." Mpho noticed the way he spoke. The same voice, the same tone, but no longer hidden. "How are you feeling?" Nkosi asked Thabo. "Better," Thabo said. "They said I'll be okay." Nkosi nodded. "I'm glad." There was a pause, not awkward, but aware. Thabo looked at Mpho, then back at Nkosi. "You're the one who helped me, right?" he asked. Nkosi hesitated for just a moment, then answered honestly. "Yes." Thabo smiled faintly. "Thank you." The simplicity of the moment made something inside Mpho shift slightly, because there was no complexity in Thabo's understanding, no analysis, no weight, just recognition. "You should rest," Mpho said gently to him. Thabo nodded, settling back against the pillow, though his eyes remained on Nkosi for a moment longer before closing. The room grew quieter, and now there was no one else to soften what needed to be said. Nkosi turned to Mpho. "I didn't come to explain anything," he said. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "No, no," he continued. "You already understand what happened. Explaining it again won't change that." Mpho studied him. "Then why are you here?" Nkosi did not answer immediately, because this time he wanted his words to come without hesitation. I came to ask you something, he said. Mpho waited, not for forgiveness, he added. Not for an answer right now, just a chance. The word lingered, simple but not light. A chance for what she asked. Nkosi held her gaze. To be honest with you, he said. Completely. Without hiding, without testing, without deciding anything for you. Mpho did not respond immediately, because she understood what he meant, and she understood what it would require. You could have done that from the beginning, she said quietly. Yes, he admitted, and you didn't. No, another silence. But this time it was not filled with tension. It was filled with truth. Mpho looked at him, not searching for answers but for consistency, for something that would tell her whether this moment was different from the ones before. What happens if I say no? She asked. Nkosi did not hesitate. Then I accept it. The answer came too easily to be a performance. And if I say yes, then I earn it, he said. Mpho exhaled slowly, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she was thinking. Carefully, deliberately. I don't want to be chosen, she said. Nkosi frowned slightly. I don't understand. I don't want to be someone you decide is worth loving, she continued. I want to be someone who stands beside you, because we choose each other. Nkosi nodded slowly. That's what I want too. Mpho held his gaze for a moment longer, then spoke. Then we start there, she said. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was something else. A beginning. Nkosi did not move, did not step closer, because he understood this was not a moment to take. It was a moment to respect. Thank you, he said quietly. Mpho gave a small nod. Not smiling, but not distant, because for the first time since everything had changed, they were no longer standing on opposite sides of the truth. They were standing within it, and from there, something real could grow. Not quickly, not easily, but honestly, and that was all either of them needed. The weeks that followed did not transform everything overnight, but they changed enough to prove that what had begun between Mpho and Nkosi was no longer fragile in the way it once had been. It was still careful, still deliberate, still growing in quiet spaces rather than dramatic moments, but it was real in a way neither of them had tried to force. Mpho continued spending most of her time at the hospital until Thabo was strong enough to leave. His recovery was not sudden, but it was steady, and with each passing day, the tension that had once filled every part of her life began to loosen just enough for her to breathe, without measuring every second. She spoke, smiled more, and for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to imagine something beyond the immediate weight of survival. Nkosi did not rush into her life. He did not replace one form of pressure with another. Instead, he remained present in ways that did not demand attention. He visited when it was appropriate, stayed away when it was needed, and listened more than he spoke. There were no grand gestures, no attempts to impress her with the scale of his world, no effort to erase what had happened by overwhelming it with something larger. He understood now that trust could not be rebuilt through effort alone. It had to be lived. The day Thabo was discharged from the hospital felt quieter than expected. There was no celebration, no dramatic release of emotion, just a soft sense of relief that settled into the space around them as they stepped outside together. The air felt different, not because it had changed, but because the fear that had once followed them everywhere had finally eased. Thabo looked around, taking in the city as if seeing it clearly for the first time in weeks. I forgot what it felt like to breathe like this, he said. Mpho smiled gently. Don't forget again. He nodded, then glanced at her. Are we going home? The question lingered, because home as it had once been no longer existed in the same way. Mpho hesitated just for a moment before answering. Yes, she said, but not the same way. Nkosi had arranged for them to move into a small, clean apartment closer to the hospital, a place that did not feel overwhelming or unfamiliar but simply safe. Mpho had resisted at first, not because she didn't see the benefit, but because she needed to be certain that accepting help did not mean losing herself. In the end, she agreed on one condition: that nothing about her life would be decided without her voice. Nkosi accepted that without hesitation, and he kept his word. The apartment was modest by Nkosi's standards, but to Mpho it felt like something she had not allowed herself to imagine. The walls were clean, the windows closed properly, and for the first time in years she did not have to think about what might break next. Thabo walked slowly through the space, touching everything as if confirming that it was real. "This is ours," he asked. Mpho nodded. "For now," she said. "We'll make it ours properly." He smiled, and that smile carried something new. Not just relief, but hope. As days turned into weeks, Mpho began to rebuild her routine, not from necessity but from intention. She returned to work, not at the same position as before, but in a role that had been offered to her after the truth about her situation became known. It was still simple, still grounded, still connected to the kind of work she understood, but it came with stability, with respect, and with the absence of quiet judgment. She accepted it, not as a favor, but as a step forward. Nkosi watched these changes without interfering. He remained close, but not controlling, present, but not overwhelming, and slowly, the space between who he had been and who he was becoming began to settle into something consistent. Their conversations changed as well. They were no longer built on uncertainty or misunderstanding, but on honesty that did not try to protect itself. They spoke about things that mattered, about fear, about responsibility, about what it meant to build something real, rather than something that simply looked complete. And in those conversations, something deeper formed. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and the city softened into quiet light, Nkosi asked Mpho to meet him at a place she had never been before. It was not extravagant, not overwhelming, just a quiet garden tucked between buildings, a space that felt removed from everything else without being distant. Mpho arrived on time, as she always did. Nkosi was already there, not in a suit, not in anything that marked him as different from anyone else. Just himself. "You chose this place," she said, as she approached. "Yes," he replied. Why? Nkosi looked around briefly. "Because it's simple," he said. "And I wanted something that didn't need to prove anything." Mpho nodded. She understood. They sat together on a wooden bench, the quiet around them comfortable, rather than empty. For a while, neither of them spoke, because they didn't need to. Then Nkosi turned slightly toward her. "I've been thinking," he said. Mpho glanced at him. "That sounds serious." "It is." She smiled faintly. "Go on." Nkosi took a breath, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted his words to come without weight or expectation. "I don't want to choose you because of what you've been through," he said, "or because of what I've seen in you. And I don't want you to choose me because of what I can give." Mpho listened carefully. "I want us to choose each other," he continued, "because we understand what it means to stand on our own and still decide to stand together." Mpho looked at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady. "And what does that look like to you?" she asked. Nkosi reached into his pocket, not quickly, not dramatically, and pulled out something small. A ring. Simple, unadorned, meaningful. "It looks like this," he said quietly. Mpho's breath caught slightly, not in shock but in the weight of the moment. "I'm not asking you to say yes because of what I am," Nkosi added. "I'm asking you to say yes if you believe in what we can become." Silence settled between them. Not heavy, not tense, just real. Mpho looked at the ring, then at him, then beyond both, into everything that had led them here. The pain, the truth, the distance, the return. And slowly she smiled, not because everything had been perfect, but because it had been honest. "Yes," she said. Nkosi exhaled quietly, something inside him, settling in a way that had nothing to do with control or certainty, but everything to do with trust. He placed the ring in her hand, not rushing the moment, not claiming it, but allowing it to become what it needed to be. And as they sat there side by side, the city continuing around them unchanged, and unaware something new began. Not a fairy tale, not a perfect ending, but a life built on something far more enduring. Truth, choice, and love that had been tested and remained.
In life, we often believe that love is about finding the right person at the right time, someone who arrives without complication, without confusion, without pain. But real love rarely works that way. Sometimes it begins in uncertainty, grows through misunderstanding, and is tested in ways that reveal not just who the other person is, but who we are when everything feels uncertain. Mpho's story reminds us that kindness is never wasted even when the world seems to ignore it, and that truth, no matter how delayed, has the power to restore what was broken when it is met with courage. Nkosi's journey shows that power without honesty is empty, and that choosing to do what is right may cost something, but it also gives something far greater in return. If this story touched you, take a moment to share where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Your voice matters here, and every story connects us in ways we don't always expect. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who believes in second chances, in healing, and in the kind of love that is built on truth rather than illusion.